Okay, good morning. Today we are continuing to talk about Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev was the secretary of the Communist Party, the leader of the Soviet Union that succeeded Stalin. And he had tumultuous reign. And yesterday we ended up, I told you a little bit about his biography, and you can read a fantastic, extensive biography that won the Pulitzer Prize by William Taubman. And I'm drawing much on this when I'm talking to you in my comments on Khrushchev, but I'm only scratching the surface. This is a really in-depth study. So if you want to know more about Khrushchev, I encourage you to pick up that. Um, Probably not in the thick of the semester, but put it on your reading list. Okay. So Khrushchev was and just a little bit up here, you see, was the first party secretary, first secretary, the general secretary. They kind of shifted it. He's the first among equals from 1953 to 1964. And he's the premier of the USSR. He has that title from 1958 to 1964. I don't tend to get bogged down in bureaucracy so much. Who loves bureaucracy, right? Or eliminating ours. But I'm making these 2 points. I'm pointing this out to you to make 2 points. Um, One, that first secretary title as a slide from general secretary title is a manifestation of this move away from the cult of leadership that was under Stalin. We'll talk about that. And so now you're the first among equals. That's going to be a big part of Khrushchev's political reforms, sort of. There's going to be many contradictions in the things we say about Khrushchev. He initiated collective leadership, but sort of remained a somewhat, there was quite a mix of democratic ethos and domineering ethos in him. And his critics thought that the domineering ethos increased with age and years in the role. And around his cultural reforms, we'll also see a good amount of contradictions. And then he moves into the role of premier, kind of official role in the government. But the point is, there were these government institutions and roles, but it was the party role that mattered. And so think about that. That's when historians wrote their postmortems of the Soviet Union. One of the things they said was one thing that was dysfunctional and lopsided about this state is that you had all these government roles, like this inspector, this head of this sphere of, aspect of governance or component or part of the bureaucracy. But those roles didn't really hold that much. Those roles weren't really where it's at. Where it's at was party power. So it's a single party state. But so the equivalent would be, say you had this like whole government bureaucracy, but all that really mattered was the leader of the party. Who's the chairman of the party, who controls the money in the party, you know, these sorts of things. And when Western historians analyzed the Soviet Union, that lopsidedness in party strength is one of the things they pointed to as an indication of a system that's dysfunctional. All right. So Khrushchev, one of the first things he did was transferred Crimea to Ukraine, and this at the time wasn't the biggest deal in the world. It wasn't the first thing we would say about Khrushchev's legacy. I put it first now because we're involved, because the world is watching a war between Russia and Ukraine because Russia has invaded Ukraine and attacked its sovereignty, and the Western world, including the United States, has come to Ukraine's support because Russia, on multiple occasions, has affirmed its recognition of Ukraine's sovereignty. But it started with this piece of territory. We'll talk more about it. So Khrushchev comes to power, and he is a reformer. And one of the things that we'll want to put on your radar screen are de-Stalinization. What was that all about? What kind of political reforms does he try and make? Mostly, he he tries to change the politics in by instituting collective leadership. He engages in he wants to have agricultural reforms. And he also wants to improve consumer life. He understands, he takes a trip to the United States in 1959, and he is quite inspired and quite motivated in international competition. And he also starts to realizes that the competition cannot only be military, that there's also a consumer side to life. And it makes sense after all, because this revolution is going to remake life for everyone. And so, if it's going to realize the promises of socialism, it's going to be a life where there's butter and milk and sufficient bread in stores that people can have access to. So early on, he's quite supported by the army, but in pursuit of kind of providing more consumer goods, he has a vision of he shifts budgets at somewhat. He downsizes the conventional military a bit in order to transfer resources from the military budget to the consumer economy. So things will be available for people. This is, and this, lo and behold, earns him many critics in the military ultimately. Now, he also wants to, he engages in de-Stalinization. When you think of Khrushchev, think of de-Stalinization. Well, what was that? So de-Stalinization consisted of, in February 1956, at the 20th Party Congress, Khrushchev made a speech, and the speech was entitled "On the Cult of Personality and Its Consequences." So what does he say? He says that Stalin committed some excesses and that it's not good to have a cult of personality in a robust, thriving society. There should never be this abject adulation to just one person. Whatever one person says goes. That cult of personality is bad for a society. And that was it. The way Taubman puts it is that it was like bringing a thimble of water where a fire hose might have been appropriate. And yet it was huge. This really shakes the party and ripples out into society. Like, it is clear that something really major is happening in this society where, just 2 decades back, lots and lots of people, and certainly leadership, had relatives that maybe were victims of the purges. At the 22nd Party Congress in 1961, Khrushchev goes farther. And this gets a little bit more public press, and in saying, Stalin did some bad things. You start to see streets and cities across the Soviet Union get renamed. Stalingrad becomes Volgograd. Stalinogorsk becomes Novomoskovsk. Stalinabad in Tajikistan becomes Dushanbe. Now that's the capital of Tajikistan now. Stalino, a city in eastern Ukraine, becomes Donetsk. now a place of where war is being fought. It also takes place in the republics, in Armenia, Romania, Albania, Bulgaria, and Poland. And note that Poland changed their Stalingrad to Katowice in 1956. They didn't wait until this kind of second secret speech redux of 1961 to take more concrete action. And and in East Germany, they renamed Stalin Ave in 1961 to Karl Marx Ave. So there's, and note, naming it to Karl Marx Ave, we are still committed communists. We're not giving up that ghost, but we are, um, the veneration of Stalin is kind of not going to happen. Although, in a memo shortly thereafter, the 1961 speech, the state issues a memo affirming the leader's greatness, right? So the contradictory all the time. And you think of Tocqueville's phrase, there is no time as dangerous for a society as when it's reforming that. I think that Khrushchev probably always had a sense of that delicate balance. On your final exam, maybe I would ask you to compare Khrushchev's and Gorbachev's reforms, approach to what they thought they were up to, what happened relative the system. So there's long been a question, why did he do it? Why did Khrushchev engage in this move? And some say out of human decency, that he just, out of human decency, and he was a believer. He believed that they could build a socialist world. And he had this sense that it couldn't be that kind of, not full-throated. We're not going to have a full-throated critique of all of Stalin's crimes, but he wanted to set the Soviet Union on a more just course. There might have been some political maneuvering in it after all, as well. Khrushchev, for all his authenticity, was a political maneuverer. You don't rise in this and survive and rise in this system without having some real political savvy to you. And Khrushchev recognized that there were a lot of people that were on the verge of coming home from the Gulag. Remember, about 1 million POWs. Well, thank you for your service. You're going to the Gulag because traitors get caught. What losers? Thanks, Stalin. But many of these people are still alive and they're about to come home. And so there's no keeping the lid on this at some level. And and Khrushchev is unwilling to shoot those who are surviving. I mean, one turn, they really don't want to kill people for these sorts of things. And so the de-Stalinization preempts perhaps talk from returning convicts to say, now they can come back and this really bad and probably unjust thing happened to them, and they can say, well, our government has acknowledged that there were excesses, and we don't properly operate like that anymore. So, so he's a believer. He wants to salvage the party, and he still has a Manichaean worldview. There are enemies out there. He still has an eschatological view of history. An eschatological view, we are going somewhere. We have a destiny. Whether you think that, history promises that the Messiah is coming, or that history promises we will get to a fifth stage on Marx's scheme of history. That's what eschatology is. And he has an eschatological view of history. We are moving towards communism. And he's an optimist. It was said, he went on record saying, the present generation of Soviet people will live under communism. And this would be realized in the main, and when will we get there? We've had so much sacrifice, so much buildings, international competition, some setbacks abounded. When will we get there? And Khrushchev kind of cornered at one point, said, well, the communism probably be realized by 1980. Some people say, this was a nail in the coffin of the system, because you get to 1980, really? This is it? This is what the revolution and all our struggles have been for. Um, so he takes this big move, and in taking this step, they renounce the terror. He renounces terror. No more, shots in the back of the head, secret, arrests, isolated arrests en masse. It's a one at a time, but it's happening in huge numbers. And some have said that terror had become the number one tool to transform the system, right? Modernization and collectivization. This was Stalin's ideological commitment to really transform the system, and it took violence to do it. And so, what happens when you renounce the number one tool at your disposal? Can the system survive? All right, so there's and kind of if you've heard anything about Khrushchev, you've probably heard that he banged his shoe on the podium at the UN and at a UN speech, and that he said the phrase, "We will bury you." Now, it's said that he probably didn't bang the podium, but maybe just actually did wave his shoe around with emotion, in standing up for the Soviet Union. And he did say this phrase, "We will bury you," at a meeting at the Polish embassy in Moscow in 1956. He believed that we will outperform the West. This was before he took a trip to the West and saw their, fields and the agricultural production of the Western plains. So but without having kind of seen that with his own eyes, he was deeply, deeply confident of this outcome. And he remained confident of this outcome, but he was quite moved by his trip from the US. Now, one of the reforms, so kind of back to his reforms, he wanted to make a lot of agricultural reforms. And so they see some of the downsides of the collective farm. And so one of the things Khrushchev tries to do is initiate reforms where there'll be more private initiative. Maybe tractor stations might be owned by a given collective to incentivize things. He has this bug in his bonnet that corn is the way to go, and he really tries to promote corn growing among the peasantry, and it met a good amount of resistance over, for example, barley, which to this day, would make grechka, this kasha that, we don't eat all that much in America, but I would eat so much when I lived in Russia. So there's some resistance to that and questions whether that was really the most efficacious route to take. And he tries to institute this virgin lands campaign. And the idea there is that there's all this steppe land out in, across from the Caspian. Well, the breadbasket of Ukraine, not on this map, is the fields of Ukraine. They call it the Chernozem. You have several feet deep of just black, fertile soil. And so once you get the nomads not raiding this area for slaves and could kind of have an army and kind of beat down nomadic threats, then this just turned into the breadbasket of the Russian Empire, of the Soviet Union. To this day, this is really, really fertile soil. As you move east from those Ukrainian plains over the Caspian and come out here into Kazakhstan, you have massive, massive steppe lands, where for centuries pastoral nomads roamed and moved their herds to eat grass. And this is also fertile soil. And so he has this idea: we will start cultivating this soil. And it's the Virgin Lands Campaign. It's initiated in the 50s and it runs until 64. Now, so we're going to plow up. So, yeah, 1954 to 1965, they run the Virgin Lands Campaign. We're going to plow up all this steppe land and make it productive farmland. They do it initially. You have a couple years of boosted production, so that's good. But quite quickly, that falls off. And in large part, there's a number of factors. Some droughts hit. That's a bit unlucky, but a cyclical part of the climate. But the wind erosion. They hadn't accounted for all those long sweeping grasses that animals could move through and chew are holding soil in place. And so when they plow up that soil and cultivate it, and then you harvest and you have a field of dirt, and the wind was merciless. Between 1960 and 1965, 12 million hectares, half of the land that had been put into cultivation as part of the Virgin Land campaigns suffered such erosion that it was no longer cultivable. You could no longer cultivate it. And so on some, if this is kind of the forest steppe, here's an imperial depiction of the forest steppe. You have Siberia is the largest taiga in the world, kind of forest that has mostly evergreen trees, very few deciduous, or well, more evergreen type pines, some of which actually lose their leaves seasonally. And then as you move southward, you kind of have this mixed forest steppe where you start to have grasslands with trees until it gives way to kind of full-on grasslands. So this is kind of a picture of that kind of green and gold landscape that is remembered fondly in many paintings and poetry and literature as well. So kind of that's a picture sort of the earth that's plowed up for the Virgin Land campaigns. And though it's an early success, ultimately doesn't work. So what else does Khrushchev do? He engages in terms of culture, there's some relaxation in cultural in the cultural sphere. Most prominently, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich is published in 1962 in the Soviet Union. This is a bombshell. Previously, the criticism had been, we are part of a just system. Some party members had suffered wrongly because there were some excesses. Mistakes were made. There were some excesses, passive voice. But now, in One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, you have this portrait of life in the Gulag. And this, getting up, being cold, waiting, in line for his gruel at the cafeteria, going to work shifts, facing, the struggles, of kind of getting through the day and having the right tool and dealing with other principles, etc. And the story is a bombshell, and it shows that, wow, it wasn't just some high-ranking party members that had suffered wrongly. There's innocent suffering acknowledged by the population at large. And so that is an example of a real bold move for cultural relaxation. But here the record is more contradictory. It's in 57, right, that Dr. Zhivago is written, and it is not allowed to be, this cannot be published in the Soviet Union. It is published abroad, much to the chagrin of the Soviet Union. And when it is Pasternak is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, he is not allowed to accept it. His mistress is, who is probably the model for Lara, is quite harassed and suffers horrible consequences. He's almost driven to suicide. So so let's not overstate the amount of cultural relaxation that's happening. And just if you'll recall, one of the most um, kind of prohibited types of statements. What was so bad about Dr. Zhivago, right? It's sort of um, open-minded at some level about the revolution's promise. But here, I'll just remind you, because you've read it as well, one of the passages, and it's about collectivization. Pasternak writes, collectivization was an erroneous and unsuccessful measure, and it was impossible to admit the error. To conceal the failure, people had to be cured by every means of terrorism, of the habit of thinking and judging for themselves, and forced to see what didn't exist, to assert the very opposite of what their eyes told them. From this came the unprecedented cruelty of the Yezhovshchina, the proclamation of a constitution that was not meant to be applied, and the introduction of elections not founded on the elective principle. So it starts as a critique of collectivization and pretty much eviscerates the entire system, being one based on laws, lies, terror, coercion, dishonesty, and kind of misrepresentation of what's really going on. So that was no chance of publishing that. Uh, so Khrushchev is, and also they, as part of this kind of, we're going to have a little bit of washing our dirty laundry in public, and we're going to reassert socialist principles. We're going to, so he kind of abolishes the mass sending of people to the gulag. He subordinates the secret police to the party. If before, and this, in the last decade or so, one of the real fruitful areas of research into the Soviet period has been in the Soviet police, as people kind of went to the archives, got what they could out of the Russian archives, which are in large part closed now. But in Eastern European countries, scholars have really started to mine archives there and produce work. So we're getting a new, we're that ultimate vision is really emerging. And I think that one of the questions that I won't answer definitively for you now, and probably have to uh, wait a bit and read all this work coming out, but is this question: was Khrushchev really successful in subordinating the secret police, um, or not? Andropov, who would later become the leader, Putin, who would later become the leader. These are people that had their start in the KGB. So that is a little bit of a question that it seems like current research is attempting to help us get a better read on. Um, all right, so I want to say a few things about this matter of belief. So he's a believer, and he thinks that the system can be better, and so he really wants to excite people. Actually, what is there? There's a joke. Uh, Stalin, Khrushchev, and Brezhnev are riding on a train, and all of a sudden the train stops moving. Well, what's going on? Why is this train stopped moving? And they come in and say, "Sorry, the train's not working." And Stalin says, "Well, go shoot the conductor and get another one, and let's get going." And that doesn't work. And Khrushchev says, let me have that. Let me have that conductor. I'm going to give him, and he gives him a pep talk. We can do it. We can build socialism. We can make this train work. We can get there. We can get there. We can do it. And that doesn't work either. And then, and Brezhnev says, well, why don't we just pull down the shades and pretend we're moving? And so, boom, boom. That's the joke. We haven't talked about Brezhnev yet, but the idea is sort of that that may be emblematic of their methods. And so, in this, ethos of we can do it, ethos of Khrushchev, he organizes things like subotniki, um, where he can where people come out subotnik. Subota is the Russian word for Saturday. And so now it's like you can show that you're a good Soviet citizen by coming out to collect garbage or paint park benches or, do the work of making a better, making our society functional and clean and happy, and volunteer your time. This was sort of, and so Saturday, Saturday mornings helping the state or that sort of thing, where that's what Subotniki were all about. There was also, they would also, people remember in the Khrushchev period, and it's not just limited to his period, but you would have, meetings in which attendees would engage in samakritika. Now, this idea of meetings was very much part of the Bolshevik than Soviet spirit from the beginning. Remember, there's lots of workers that learn how to read at reading group meetings in the early days of the Soviet Union. And now by Khrushchev's period, it's you have these Samakritika meetings where you would go around in a circle and people would kind of confess the ways in which they had fallen short as Soviet citizens and fallen short in their adherence to Marxist Leninism and building a socialist society. And this, I mean, these could engage in, they could have been sincere. People report there was also kind of a lot of performativity and coercion and sort of bullying to spout this orthodoxy. And in some ways, many, students of the Soviet Union, kind of looking at um, some of the adherence to theories like white fragility and acknowledging privilege and things like that really got deeply uncomfortable because they see those echoes of this, Khrushchevian samakritika that they did in the Soviet Union, where people are forced to spout a particular orthodoxy. And the echoes made many people uncomfortable with some of what you might say the excesses of what's been branded the DEI movement. And I think it's fair to say one need not be anti-woke to um, recognize that sort of historical resonance in some of this coerced. We can do it. We will build a better society, and you will say the right things in order to help us get there. So that was also a component of Khrushchev's tenure. Khrushchev also, as I said before, he wants to improve consumer life. He recognizes that, it's not just, the game isn't just, the competition isn't just military. And so one of the most intense things that he makes as a priority is improving housing. And so in you see a lot of investment in just building more housing. It's still they're urbanizing, and this building program began in 1950. And it ended up that about 60 million Soviet citizens end up living in these sorts of apartments that are started and mostly built during Khrushchev's term. And they're, I've heard people say like, oh, they're pretty good, but they're kind of, a bit cheap, prefabricated. Many of them, they don't have balconies. Um, Although this picture right down here that you're seeing in the this picture, there is a balcony. So, there's a little, and there's balconies as well. But many of them, if you got a less good one, you don't even have a balcony. So if you live on a 10th floor and you can open the window, but you can't quite go out and get just a little patch of fresh air, it's not quite as nice. In my time in Germany, we lived in an apartment building, and boy, having a balcony made such a difference. So, many of them have no balconies, and a lot of them too, you've got, five or six floors. You don't have, or is it six or seven floors? No, five or six floors, I think. Um, and you don't have uh, elevators. So, like, if you know, living in a five-story walk up, carrying your groceries gets you fit, I guess, unless you're injured. So these were kind of the Khrushchevis that became this quintessential, they're nearly ubiquitous. You see them everywhere, but it's the state. The state is gonna promise to provide housing. And this is one of the way it manifests this promise. And in some ways, many people have a real um, affection. You'll run the spectrum if you talk to people about, their opinions on the housing erected in Khrushchev's period, but it starts to be called Khrushchev, kind of the like buildings built under Khrushchev. And so yeah, so that's a bit of a success. There's a bit of success in transferring things to the consumer sector, but at some level, no good deed, no good deed goes unpunished is a Russian saying. Do you hear the dark humor in that? Um, yeah. Нет доброго дел без наказания. There's no good deed without a punishment, and it's a cynical thing that you know, keep your eyes out for the next time you have an opportunity to apply that in your life. But in some ways, you start to have per capita productivity and income improving a little bit with growth in the consumer sector. But the command economy just couldn't really meet demand. So this is the time in the Soviet period, kind of late Khrushchev and then into Brezhnev's period, where you start having people, they have money and there's nothing to buy. And this kind of is a story we hear over in the story because the command economy never really succeeds in fulfilling all in meeting the demand side of things that was and could have been there. All right. So there is an improvement in, Moscow, as I talked about Moscow a good amount last time, and you're seeing new houses, taxis start to appear, so there is, this service to meet a kind of consumerist demand. 27,000 private cars were registered in Moscow by, I think, 1959. You start to have, they introduce buses instead of streetcars. There's more stores with products. There's a bit less fear. The leader, and this maybe circles back to a bit to political culture, the leader starts to get referred to as Nikita Sergeyevich, your name and patronymic, as any grown up is referred to as the teacher or whatnot, instead of Voj, the chief, which was the title people had started to kind of, um, what do you say, chief? Thank you, chief. Yes, chief. Hello, chief. Goodbye, chief. Now it's Nikita Sergeyevich. So all in all, mixed bag. And next time we're going to come back to kind of the international competition and talk about Korea and Vietnam and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the U-2 incident and that sort of engaging with the wider world, much of which happened on Khrushchev's watch. But I just want to take you up to the end of his tenure, is that as he's doing all these things with mixed results. I wanted to, one more thing I wanted to mention about on the cultural front in terms of that mixed bag. We have a little bit of cultural relaxation, but we're also going to have a reassertion of socialist values. And one of those reassertions included an anti-religion campaign. So under Khrushchev, the majority of the monasteries that still existed in the Soviet Union are closed. as are as are so many churches. Oh, I didn't bring the number with me, but thousands of churches that had been allowed to operate. Some, had been left alone since the beginning. Some maybe got to reopen during World War II, but many of them shut down. So that there's that kind of reassertion that we're not going to follow false guards that will distract us from our project of building socialism. Um, this mixed bag comes with building enemies. Certainly in the military, after downsizing that budget, he doesn't have as many friends as he once thought he did. He had alienated various components of his base in the military by reorganizing the party. It's tough being a politician and saying no to certain constituencies. But the one thing you can say about Khrushchev is that as much as he was a politician, he had done some savvy maneuvering. When we look at his downfall, we say, oh, here's a politician that didn't just take care of his base, which might have been the more politique thing to do, but he was operating from a vision of what he wanted to see Soviet society be. I personally have to put that in the plus column for him. Um, he also, you know, he also, but in the negative column, I definitely put that he generated a good amount of resentment for other things like the nepotistic promotion of family members to positions that everyone looking around said they don't quite merit that position. For example, he put his son-in-law in charge of Izvestia, this important state newspaper. And even in the society, we look at the society and say that is so unfree. But that sort of corruption, that using public office to advance private interests was also contributed to Khrushchev's uh, downfall and having people think he has to go. And so when he was down on vacation in the South in October of 1964, he was summoned to a special meeting and deposed. And Taubman says he knew it was coming. He didn't resist. And he was called to a presidium meeting among his other changes in party leadership. What had been called the Politburo was now called the Presidium. And he was attacked for his, quote, failed reforms and erratic behavior. This is also the Cuban Missile Crisis. Did He didn't come out looking good on that. That hurt him a lot, that kind of international scene that we'll talk more about next time. And so he retired. He spent his latter years living in Russia. He wrote his memoirs, also fantastic, worthy reading. And he died in 1971 peacefully in the USSR. He's the only Soviet leader who wasn't buried in the Kremlin wall. Um, but in some ways, it speaks to his legacy that under Khrushchev, the Soviet Union turned away from the murderous terror that had been the tool that Stalin reached for regularly. Um, all right, so we'll wrap up there. Any questions? Any questions, comments? All right, and so actually, we are talking next about, so we're a little bit ahead of time, but you're all reading Zinke Boys right now about the Afghanistan war, and we will talk about that together on a group as Friday, and then next Monday I'll return to this kind of international Cold War, taking us up through in kind of this speeding, galloping survey, taking us up through Afghanistan. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. I'm here for any questions, comments. Let's see. All right, great. Have a great day. I'll see you Friday.